February 27, 2005. This is Viz, and welcome to part 6 of the series entitled The Magicians of Mutability. And with us today is Philip D. Collins, who with his brother Paul co-authored the book The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, an examination of epistemic autocracy from the 19th to the 21st century. He also he actually edited, Paul's book, The Hidden Face of Terrorism. And you can find some of Philip's articles on a number of websites, biped.info, conspiracyarchive.com, and poke around for Paranoia Magazine, MK Zine, and News with Views. And I want to welcome you to the show today, Philip.
Thank you very much, Viz.
Are we doing a tag team today, or is it just you?
Tag team.
Oh, all right. So Paul's there also.
Yep. I'm right here, Viz.
How did I clue that out so quickly? All right, and we also have Paul with us, as you know, the author of The Hidden Face of Terrorism. And thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Viz.
Topically, what are we going to hit today?
I think that it would be important for us to now head on to what's the latest installment in the erection of this scientific dictatorship. Currently, we see the whole thing being put together by a group of technocrats known as the neoconservatives, and we should really look into what they are and to really what the game plan is from their perspective and what it's bringing about. We should also take a look into Cecil Rhodes and the unique part that he played in this whole project of creating a scientific dictatorship, one like what was described by H.G. Wells in The Shape of Things to Come, and Aldous Huxley in his books Brave New World and Brave New World Revisited.
Sure, and I mean, Wells was a contemporary of Rhodes.
That's correct.
And I don't know, they have so many interlocking clubs, those old men. They have the Coefficient Club and, the Fabian Socialists, but there was a nexus of individuals in England at that time that had pretty much laid out a plan for world dominance, did they not?
That is correct. And one of the individuals that was most important to that whole project was Cecil Rhodes. I really can't think of one man throughout the last century and who really affected human history and the course which the whole of human civilization has taken more than Cecil Rhodes. So important was his role that Carroll Quigley basically based a lot of his book on the man's work. He just saw the man as having shaped the majority of what we know today to be our modern world.
Yeah, for those people who want to read more about this connection, as Philip said, Carroll Quigley has written 2 books. One is an absolute tome. The other is The Anglo-American Establishment, and the tome to which I referred is Tragedy and Hope. And you'll find a lot of interesting things in there with regard to the plans of these gentlemen who actually term the phrase that it is the white man's burden to rule the world.
That's correct. He basically saw the Anglo-Saxons as being the master race. His ideas went back really to a teacher of his that he had, John Ruskin, who believed that the ruling class of England had possessed this tradition of morality, of beauty, that basically brought civility to the world and was superior to all other traditions. And his fear was that the other peoples of the world would begin to assert themselves, and that this ruling class tradition would be submerged and lost. And so the only way that you could prevent that is by extending the rule of the British ruling class to the rest of the world. And these ideas of Ruskin were so powerful upon when it came to Cecil Rhodes' thinking that Cecil Rhodes actually worked with several other ruling class figures, Alfred Milner, Stead, Lord Balfour, to name a few, and created this secret society known as the Society of the Elect, dedicated to that one goal and that one purpose. And many researchers have looked at this plan and looked at this particular conspiratorial undercurrent, and have done a lot of good work uncovering what all was done in that regard. What many people don't understand, however, and what has been looked at not too often looked at, is the fact that this concept that they were trying to bring into existence, this utopian concept, was basically the concept of a scientific dictatorship. It's little known that in 1877, Rhodes became a life member of Freemasonry's Apollo chapter at Oxford University, and he didn't really consider his membership in the lodge to be a serious venture, but he still admitted nonetheless that Freemasonry had shaped a great deal of his thinking, and that means that he was in all likelihood exposed to the idea of this occult idea of becoming that was disseminated on the popular level where with the masses as Darwinism. And also we see him being influenced by an individual named Winwood Reade, William Winwood Reade, and Reade's book, The Martyrdom of Man. And it was a Darwinian book. He was a Darwinian Gnostic that believed that humanity could reach this state of apotheosis, but only through terrible torrential trial and suffering and an upward flight that basically involved a struggle, the survival of the fittest. And so you have these two ideological influences on Rhodes that basically also shape the philosophical foundations of the concept of a scientific dictatorship.
You know, when they talk about becoming, not only in Freemasonry, but that kind of pops up, maybe called something different, in a number of occult religions. What is it exactly that the initiate becomes? What's the goal?
Well, essentially, the goal is to basically facilitate evolution. This gradual process of transformism, which is precisely what Darwinism is. It's just one more ideational link in the chain, because the doctrines of transformism date back at least 6,000 years, all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and in Babylon. And Darwinism was simply the segue, if you will, for the doctrines of transformism that were promulgated in that era, and basically brought that occult idea of becoming into our era. It was disseminated within the context of metaphysical naturalism to give it more of a more of a secular feel. But if you look at it, essentially, it's premised upon the Kabbalistic concept of the golem, which holds that matter created itself, that which is dead can become alive, all on its own. It's also premised on Gnostic doctrine, in that the self-creation doctrine then makes possible the doctrines of Gnosticism, which are self-salvation. But the end result of this upward climb, of this advance in the evolutionary process, they believe, is the actual dawning of a post-human era, when humanity ceases to be humanity and becomes God. And
I think an important thing to point out at this point too, Viz, is that once you peel away these layers to this onion, anybody that's had even a small modicum of Sunday school, back when they were children, will instantly recognize and appreciate the fact that this goes back to the book of Genesis in the 3rd chapter, where the serpent basically tells man that ye shall be as gods. It's the old lie, but it's packaged in this pseudoscientific garb, and most people who aren't able to see it initially, but when you begin to peel it away, you find that that's all that we're really dealing with here.
You just raised a question within me, and I don't want to put us down a digression.
Of course.
However, if I could ask it, and that is, it seems to me, and this is just my opinion, that when we have the choice in the garden being made for the knowledge of good and evil, that was where humankind chose knowledge, and I would say as an extension of that, as we see today, technology, instead of faith. And what we're seeing now, so many thousands of years later, and that is humankind is really flirting now with what it chose in the garden, and that is to do everything that the Creator could do.
Absolutely. If you take, for instance, now technology and science, they are wonderful tools in and of themselves, but they are impersonal forces, and largely it is the motives of the people who use it that use them that determines their nature. But if you look at, for instance, technology, we derive that word from the ancient Greek word techne, which basically means craft. And craft, of course, is associated with the witchcraft, which in turn is associated with the word Wicca, which is then derived from the word wicker, which means to bend, as in the bending of reality. And so really, technology can be used so as to resculpt and reshape that which was created. It can be used to direct creation down whatever paths we desire. If, for instance, you take a look at Hoover Dam, there's an example of how mankind has used technology to redirect creation. Now this can be a good thing. This can also be a bad thing, given the fact that the forces that currently control technological and scientific research that are largely directing it are of very dubious motives. I would have to say, though, that it doesn't bode well in terms of what they will bring to us with scientific and technological advances. It will be more so directed towards the resculpting of reality for humanity, the resculpting of humanity itself.
I think that it's also important to point out that both what the serpent was offering man and what God was offering man were both pathways to empowerment. But the problem is that the serpent's pathway to empowerment was totally devoid of any responsibility, any obedience, any accountability to a higher authority. I do believe that when you read through the scriptures that God very much wanted mankind to aid him in this whole project and enterprise of creation, and that's why the image of God was placed in man. The image of God is basically we see it in the desire to create. It's the desire to approximate our Creator by creating things just as God does. But the problem with the path that the serpent was offering was that it was totally devoid of any accountability or obedience to God. And when you begin to do as Protagoras prescribed, make yourself the measure of all things, then all things become all right. Even immoral and unjust actions you can somehow rationalize in your own mind, and that's what we see today. We see mankind rationalizing the idea of moving beyond humanity through the transhumanist movement, utilizing nanotechnology to move us down a path of to godhood, and just using technology in a way that actually will bring about severe consequences for us as a race.
You're listening to the Grassy Knoll on Dade City Micro Radio. We have with us for our part 6 of the series Magicians of Mutability both Philip and Paul Collins. Their books, The Hidden Face of Terrorism and The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. These books are available on ieuniverse.com and amazon.com. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. You can also pick up articles at www.biped.info and at conspiracyarchive.com, and also be watching for the April issue of Paranoia Magazine. It'll be featuring an abridged version of my article, Fiction as a Precursor to Fact, Sci-Fi Predictive Programming, and the Emergent World Religion.
I would say that the umbrella term that would cover this entire series would be scientific dictatorship. Would you agree?
Yes, very much so.
All right. Do we want to take a look at the eugenics movement and how this weighs in toward a scientific dictatorship?
Sure.
All right. If I could, I want to do one thing, because I wanted you gentlemen to hear this, if it's okay.
Okay.
I know you're going to pick up the eugenics movement from probably the 60s.
Sure.
What I did find, what I alluded to before, and I just would like to relate this only because it seems like it was perhaps a real threshold moment. And this is from Edwin Black's War Against the Weak. On May 16th, 1904, Francis Galton delivered an important address entitled Eugenics, Its Definition, Scope, and Aims, stressing actuarial progress, marriage preferences, and general education. This is a quote. Overzeal leading to hasty actions, he cautioned, would do harm by holding out expectations of a near golden age, which will certainly be falsified and cause the science to be discredited. He added, the first and main point is to secure the general intellectual acceptance of eugenics as a hopeful and most important study. And here's where it gets good, guys. But the famous novelist and eugenic extremist H.G. Wells then rose to publicly rebuke Galton, bluntly declaring, and this is a quote, it is in the sterilization of failures and not in the selection of successes for breeding that the possibility of an improvement of the human stock lies. On that afternoon in Britain, the lines were clearly drawn. It was positive eugenics versus negative eugenics. Do you care to comment?
Yes. Essentially, what you have there is basically they lay basically the groundwork
right.
for the overall eugenics ideology. Basically, the belief is that evolution can be directed, and that mankind will take evolution by the reins and can direct it in a negative or positive direction. This was also a mandate laid down by another Freemason, T.H. Huxley, who also acted as Darwin's official bulldog, if you will. In many of his statements, he laid out the mandate for humanity to direct human evolution, and there's two directions. Eugenics, which can lead humanity towards the breeding of a superior stock. It's derived from the original Greek word for well-born. So the idea is that as we manipulate our heredity, as we manipulate our genetic reproduction, we will generate more and more well-born stock, and then what they call dysgenics, which is essentially retrograde evolution, as they believe, and that leads to what they would consider lesser stocks, inferior forms of life.
Now, also, we see at the beginning of the century Rockefeller getting involved with his population council. And didn't eugenics and perhaps, euthanasia really start to gain some strength on both sides of the Atlantic and may have been abrogated by World War II? Do you want to touch upon that at all?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that you bring up Rockefeller. At the 1932 New York Eugenics Congress, which was supervised by the International Federation of Eugenics Societies, this meeting featured several Nazi ideologues, including Dr. Ernest Rudin. Rudin was a psychiatrist at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Genealogy and Demography in Berlin, and facilities devoted to his so-called research took up an entire floor of the institute and was financed by none other than the Rockefeller dynasty. Well, at a 1928 meeting of the International Federation in Munich, Rudin had spoke on what he called, quote, mental aberration and race hygiene, unquote. But at any rate, at the 1932 New York Eugenics Congress, which was really setting the pace for the Holocaust and what was to come in Nazi Germany, Rudin would be unanimously elected president of the International Federation, and his ascendance to such a prominent position was owed in part to his work as founder of the German Society for Race Hygiene, and he was the co-founder of the organization was Alfred Ploitz, who was also vice president of the Eugenics Federation. Ernest Rudin also wrote for Birth Control Review, which was Margaret Sanger's magazine and was the birth control movement's official journal at the time. And it would be with Margaret Sanger, of course, that you would see Planned Parenthood crop up here in the United States. And Planned Parenthood would provide an organizational conduit for the crackpot eugenicists and race scientists that had to go underground after the Holocaust came to light. Essentially, with the Holocaust revelations, things became more difficult for them to carry on their work, and so they had to tone down their rhetoric. They had to stop talking so much about race and eugenics and instead tout terms and mantras like reproductive rights, a woman's right to choose, and what have you. But it's essentially the same agenda, which is eugenical regimentation of humanity.
In the United States, did you come across that there was actually sterilization taking place of those, shall we say, bloodlines that seemed to be inclined to criminal behavior?
There was sterilization taking place on a mass scale here in the United States at Lynchburg, Virginia, I believe, and the amount that occurred there was well into the thousands. It was enormous, and it kind of got overshadowed by what went on in Nazi Germany and their project in eugenics. But it's important to remember that what happened in Germany originated here in the United States and over in Britain as well, and it's very little spoken about in the textbooks, but it was very much a reality.
Yes, as a matter of fact, the 1932 Eugenics Congress was pretty much organized here in the United States by Averell Harriman, a member of the Secret Skull and Bones Society, and his mother was the primary financier of the race science movement in America in 1910, and she was responsible for the construction of the Eugenics Record Office, which was a subsidiary of the Galton National Laboratory in London, and the Eugenics Office wanted to sterilize 15 million Americans by 1980 to create a perfect man. And Averell's mother was frequently accompanied by none other than George Herbert Walker Bush to horse races. So you see, this really, while Germany is where you saw eugenics popularized. This is really is a Western phenomenon. Took place in the Western Hemisphere.
Let me ask you: do you have a date for that pronouncement about the sterilization to get, the perfect beast by 1980s? What year did you do that?
I know that I have a statement somewhere, or it was either a memo or a statement, and I'd have to look it up for you. But essentially, yeah, the project of the eugenics office was basically its projected timetable was for 1980, hopefully, which of course they didn't pull off. They were unable to accomplish that goal of sterilizing 15 million Americans.
Well, it seems that this eugenics movement did quietly go away for a while because of World War II. You stated in the outline by which we're going that in the 60s we see a resurgence. Now, certainly now in the 90s.
Oh, absolutely.
I've seen it in 2000. I mean, Peter Singer and the tiles that come flying through here, through the library, almost disturbing. But, I can't remember because I was a kid at the time and not obviously involved in this kind of thing. But can you trace somewhere post-World War II, 60s or whatever, where you get a resurgence in this mindset?
You want to give that a shot, Paul?
I'd say that it really began to start to become an issue again with the Bush crowd. George Bush, for instance, was, I believe, an associate of one William H. Draper. And Draper had been the founder and chairman of the Population Crisis Committee, and he had been the vice chairman of the Planned Parenthood Federation. And Draper had called for U.S. talks, public discussion over the problems in non-white areas of the world concerning the so-called population bomb. And the whole question with the Bush crowd was no longer brought to the floor as eugenics, as that word had now taken on a very negative tone in the public eye. It now was presented as a population problem, the problem of the world having a supposed carrying capacity, and that and the idea that at a certain point there would be too many people, and that it would begin to bring about scarcities on a mass scale, and bring about chaos and disaster. And behind all of that nonsense and that Chicken Little theorizing was really just the idea of selective breeding, of picking and choosing who was going to live and who was going to die, and who was going to be the dominant races, and which races would basically be phased out. George Bush was very instrumental in bringing to the Republican Task Force on Earth Resources and Population the race scientist William Shockley, who is touted very highly today in American Nazi circles. If you go to white nationalist websites, you'll find that he is praised as just this modern day genius ideologue. And then also he brought in, I believe, Paul Ehrlich, the individual that wrote the book over the population bomb.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Phil.
Yes, he wrote it, which, keeping with what you brought up, Viz, with the 60s experiencing the resurgence of eugenics, his book was published in 1968, if I'm not mistaken, and it just caused a clamor. People were panicking. There were PBS specials over the carrying capacity issue, and Paul Ehrlich if I'm not mistaken, he also appeared before the
Yes,
Republican Task Force on Earth Resources and Population.
He did. And do you recall, Viz, how last time you and I were speaking, we got off onto the topic of peak oil?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that in his book, The Population Bomb, Paul Ehrlich actually says that if population isn't culled and brought down to a reasonable level, that there was going to be oil crisis. So we see the possible beginnings of this whole idea of peak oil and the connection between it and the idea of controlling the population. Again, there was a time when I treated that as a foregone conclusion. I know when I was doing research into the issue, I cited CNN reports and BBC reports. And I saw it as I didn't see anything dubious behind it, because my rationale was, well, you know, it's a finite resource, so it just makes sense that you can't keep pumping it out of the ground forever. However, when you look back into the writings of Paul Ehrlich and you look back into the writings of other population control fanatics, you see a connection again right back to this peak oil thing. So it seems that while some writers may be have humanity's best interest in mind in bringing this up, and might not be aware of any dubious ideas behind the whole concept, that the concept of peak oil is in fact just one more cover for the idea of calling the human herd.
Well, I'll tell you what I do remember, and I remember very clearly, that back in the late 60s, there was this gloom and doom speak that found its way even onto like the Johnny Carson show. And I remember this clearly because I had just graduated high school with my best friend. We're sitting watching the show, and they had some environmentalists on, and he painted such a gloom and doom picture, you know, like, and Johnny Carson, in the way that he could, was giving that sideways glance to the camera, like, you know, what's going on here? And he finally asked him a question, like, can you, like, sum this up? And the environmentalist said, well, he goes, let me put it to you this way. If you're on the Titanic, it doesn't matter if you were first class or steerage. And my friend and I looked at each other like, our lives are over. You know, I mean, we're just getting out of high school, and we're done.
Yeah.
But also, that same year, actually around 69 or 70, when they try to, well, they very definitely hearken in the age of Aquarius.
Yeah, well, you know, these scare tactics have cropped up, you know, here and there over the period of time, over history. Here in the United States, where this whole idea of extinction being more than a remote possibility, being an inevitability unless extreme measures were brought to bear on humanity. I remember that when Philip and myself were just single-digit age children in grade school, that ABC, which I believe at the time had been bought by a firm that had as its main lawyer a former DCI, put out this movie called The Day After. I don't know. Do you recall that movie?
It was on ABC. You're right, with Jason Robards.
That movie, just to call it social engineering is just downplaying the significance of its role in what it was doing in terms of shaping the mindset of the average American. I remember our parents wanted us to see that movie because they were very much part of the whole nuclear scare crowd. They believed that there was something to the idea of the Soviet Union and the United States destroying the world through nuclear exchange, and it shocked and traumatized. You know, I know myself for the longest time, and you know, basically got me to believing that you know, some rather extreme measures were going to have to be implemented if humanity was to avoid a catastrophic end.
I tell you, couple of things real quick, and we'll move on to some of the other talking points. Remember that at the turn of the decade, 60 into 70, you had the Club of Rome, who's never short on proclaiming gloom and doom.
Absolutely.
Backed Aurelio Pecci's book, The Chasm Ahead, and if you read that, you find out how much they dealt in hyperbole and not so much on facts. It's all these extrapolations that go dark. Also,
absolutely.
You got Brzezinski's, what is it, Between Two Ages, the Technotronic Era?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You know, whether I get era and ages mixed up, it doesn't matter. But the thing is, in that book also, he says, well, you know, this is what's going to happen. And let me just add this, and we'll get back into the flow. Have you ever heard of Dr. John Coleman?
Oh, yeah. Dr. John Coleman wrote a Committee of 300.
That's right. I spoke to him the other day. He's going to be on, and what's really set a fire into him. And this goes back to a movie, if you remember, that was made for TV on ABC as well, called Stand, which was based on a Stephen King novel about a bio attack. Anyway, Coleman said that he had written in 1984 an article about avian flu and how the British government feared this more than terrorism. Well, now we're being prepared, if you've noticed the last couple of weeks, for an attack of avian flu that would have 1918 consequences. So I'm thinking back to the movie Stand about how this could happen, and of course, as we all know, you know, Hollywood with its Hollywood will tell you what's coming. But we're seeing right now either a massive scare tactic or, as Coleman does believe, this time they're going to cut this baby loose.
It's very interesting. Also, if you read H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come, which I consider another piece of sci-fi predictive programming, because the prognostications that he presents are uncannily precise. In it, he presents what he calls, quote-unquote, the raid of the germs. So it would appear that humanity has been conditioned and prepared for an eventual pandemic release of diseases, which again really serves the purposes of the elite very well, because they really help in calling what they would consider surplus population.
It'll be really interesting too, as an aside, how much they're going to try to trump up vaccinations, which are every bit as bad and serves the globalist purposes as the actual pandemics that they cut loose.
Absolutely.
So it'll be a very interesting late summer, I think. If the timing of this is for the famous fall, which is usually flu season. Moving right along, what do you mean by Gnostic techno eugenics?
Okie doke. Well, essentially, today we see eugenics basically assuming a new incarnation with the transhumanist movement. In essence, transhumanism represents a new incarnation of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is basically a distortion of Christian theology and Platonism. Like Christianity and Platonism, Gnosticism emphasizes this division between the corporeal and the incorporeal, or the spiritual and the material. However, the distortion begins with Gnosticism's contention that the temporal spatial is tantamount to a hell where the spirit is confined by the demonic agents of time and space, and the only way to overcome these demonic agents, according to the Gnostic, is to achieve gnosis and alter humanity's sensate being. In so doing, the Gnostic believes that he or she can imanticize the eschaton and establish heaven on earth. Now, this was also the aspiration of both the Nazis and the communists. It's also the dream of transhumanism, which contends that our humanity is merely a consequence of time and space. Bart Costco, a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Southern California, espoused a core precept of transhumanist doctrine, and I'll read it exactly, word for word, as he put it, quote, "Biology is not destiny. It was just nature's first quick and dirty way to compute with meat. Chips are destiny," unquote. So in this contention, in the transhumanist context, our biological condition as humans is analogous to hell, and technology is an instrument for imanticizing the eschaton. transhumanist characteristic Gnosticism probably owes its existence to the movement's Darwinian premises. Darwinism, again, is in essence a Gnostic myth, and it's predicated upon the metaphysical claim that living things created themselves, which is encapsulated within the thesis of biogenesis. And this metaphysical claim provides the foundation for Gnostic doctrines of self-salvation and self-deliverance. Neo-Darwinians, such as Richard Dawkins, have frequently recapitulated Gnostic notions. Dawkins, for instance, has referred to natural selection as an evil yet necessary process for the evolution of the species. So this statement infers that the corporeal machinations of nature are inherently evil, while Dawkins ostensibly espouses a non-anthropomorphic view of nature. That certainly hasn't stopped him from ascribing human traits like evil to it. At any rate, this is pure Gnosticism, and it provides the philosophical foundation for the new techno-eugenics.
With regard to the statement about technocracy's latest incarnation, neoconservatism, who is it? What is the technocracy? What other incarnations might they have been responsible for, and why is neoconservatism the latest package from them?
Well, the crusade for a technocratic kind of government was carried out by several different groups throughout history. Many people don't realize this, but going back to the Illuminist, the order of Illuminists started in 1776 on May 1st by Weishaupt. That movement was actually working towards something along technocratic lines, and if you read James H. Billington's book Fire in the Minds of Men, you find out that there was an overlap of ideas between the Illuminist Babeuf and his Babeufist conspiracy and the ideas of Saint Simon, who is considered to be the father of technocratic thought. The Soviet Union was an attempt to set up a technocracy. Hitler's Germany was supposedly moving in the same direction, and today we see in the United States the movement towards technocracy, that whole mantle being picked up by the neoconservatives, who really are, I think you can describe them as disgruntled supporters of FDR's New Deal, which moved in several aspects towards technocracy, although it didn't go far enough for their taste. And they're also Trotskyites.
Oh, yes.
What was that?
Oh, good point. Absolutely good point.
Well, and there's, I remember that I was on the Alex Jones show with Michael Corbin, substituting for Alex that day because I believe that Alex Jones was at the RNC, the National Convention, and I brought this topic up, and there were several people just called in and were totally disgruntled by the fact that I would suggest that the neoconservatives were merely Trotskyites. But if you look at the ideas that they espouse, you see this parallel between the teachings of the ideas of the neoconservatives and the teachings of Trotsky. Michael Lynn, who is a former neoconservative, brings up the fact that the neoconservatives have this idea, this concept of, quote, global democratic revolution. And then you compare this idea of a global democratic revolution with Trotsky's Fourth International, which was supposed to establish a state of permanent revolution, and they are nearly identical. William Crystal, who is considered, not William, his father, Irving, Irving Kristol, who's considered to be the godfather of neoconservatism, has written about the fact that he was a Trotskyite, and says that he doesn't have a bitter memory concerning that whole affair, and that he's relatively unrepentant. Now, there's an important point, caveat I have to throw in here. There have been some very eloquent writings on the part of some conservatives decrying the idea of technocracy. And I have to admit they're very eloquent, and there's some really good essays that have been written that are out there. So it leads one to believe that the neoconservatives are actually against the idea of technocracy. However, in Frank Fisher's book, Technocracy and the Politics of Expertise, he points out that the neoconservatives seem to only be opposed to the idea when it's employed by their supposed liberal opposition, and also when it comes to their turn to prescribe ideas and cures for society's ills. They merely bring up technocratic ideas based in a conservative kind of shell, placed in a conservative kind of shell. It's interesting that Frank Fisher says, well, in spite of themselves, in spite of all their anti-technocratic rants, they themselves, end up supporting the idea of a technocracy.
Also, our brand of neoconservatists, not only influenced by Trotsky, but by another individual that Trotsky influenced, who influenced in turn these neoconservatives, and that is Leo Strauss.
Absolutely.
And isn't it interesting that Leo and John Dewey and I believe, Skinner, and I'm not sure about Benjamin Bloom, all these individuals who would like to treat the human being as a widget and are more concerned about training than teaching, all these what I would call anti-human ideologies seem to come out of the University of Chicago.
Absolutely. And it's very interesting because Strauss, in turn, and here's what a lot of Christians who voted for Bush and his administration, which is pervaded by neoconservative ideologues, don't take into consideration. They haven't done the homework or research. Is that Strauss was largely influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, and Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, proclaimed in his works that God was dead, that our will to power was the primary constituent of reality, that whatever we will and whatever we deem permissible, that's what constitutes reality. But this is what Nietzsche said. I'm going to quote him directly now and everything. And this kind of dovetails with the trajectory of eugenics. Quote, "Society as the trustee of life is responsible to life for every botched life that comes into existence. And as it has to atone for such lives, it ought consequently to make it impossible for them ever to see the light of day. It should in many cases actually prevent the act of procreation, and may, without any regard for rank, descent, and intellect, hold in readiness the most rigorous forms of compulsion and restriction, and under certain circumstances have recourse to castration. Thou shalt do no murder is a piece of ingenuous puerility compared with thou shalt not beget. The unhealthy must at all cost be eliminated, lest the whole fall to pieces," unquote. Automatically, the astute reader will recognize in that quote the traditional themes of eugenics, Malthusian demands for the prohibition of procreation amongst certain populations, and compulsory sterilization. His tirade also reveals a collectivist element to it, because he refers to the social whole. He bestows primacy upon the social whole. And this again is one of the major influences for Strauss, and and by extension the neoconservative movement. And if Christians were to have done their homework and thought this through, I mean, this man Nietzsche called Jesus Christ, quote, and he called him an idiot. If they were to have looked at the ideological foundations for the administration that they were voting in, and I think they'd have to seriously question their vote.
Well, what's interesting also, that was a Nietzschean quote, was it not?
Absolutely.
Well, also all these fathers of modern education, Dewey, et al., all went over to the Wundt School of Experimental Psychology in Germany.
Absolutely.
And then they came back with all these wonderful, warm, loving ideologies and practologies. Also, yes, collectivism is what the American education system is all about right now. Individualism has to die.
That's right.
And collectivism is now in the fore. And I have to say, it may seem innocuous, but all this group work that's being so bandied about as being a great thing is all about, I would call it a leveling of all intellects, so that you just get one basic great individual. In other words, it's mediocrity rules.
Absolutely. In fact, that takes it back to, and this is basically the foundation, the foundation of the religious doctrine of the scientific dictatorship, as you put it, the leveling of all intellects so as to create just one mind. H.G. Wells called it the mind of the race, or racial mind, right. The racial memory. And essentially the idea is eventually to amalgamate human consciousness into a single hive mind, if you will. The Freemasons call this hive mind the group soul or collective soul. You also see this in Gnostic doctrine, where they believe that in the beginning human consciousness was amalgamated into one single soul, and it eventually experienced a diaspora and became individuated entities. And this also was firmly embedded in Big Bang cosmology, which of course is part and parcel of Darwinian evolution, in which in the beginning you have a singularity, and that singularity exploded in a Big Bang, and now we have the plurality that we have today. And what these utopians and what this ideational continuum of coercive utopianism holds is that we are gradually migrating back towards that singularity. We are gradually migrating back towards that hive mind, and it's very much still alive. You see it in the transhumanist movement, particularly with convergent technologies projects. They hope that one day you'll be able to download your consciousness into computers and eventually become just one psychocognitive singularity through cyberspace. But it's very much part of neoconservatism as well. It's very much collectivist. As Irving Kristol put it, they never really had any problems with the monolithic state. They never really had problems with the collectivist state, and in fact, viewed it as an inevitability.
We're with Philip and Paul Collins, both of whom have contributed to two books, The Hidden Face of Terrorism, and also The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. They're available online at ieuniverse.com and amazon.com. And also there's a number of websites where you can read some articles from them, and that would be most likely theconspiracyarchive.com. They do a great job. Biped.info, also news with views, Paranoia Magazine, and others. In the time that we have left, can I posit something for you both to react to?
Sure.
I got something. Let's see, we're coming up about 4 minutes left. Dr. Bill Deagle out of Canada was in an interview with Butch Paul, who's on the Genesis Communication Network. And, I mean, he just gave some eye-opening information, and we're going to try to get him on the show. But let me throw this out to you. I'm going to ask you to react, and we're going to probably close this show on that note, okay?
Sure.
All right, Dr. Daigle says the best way to think about this is to look into the future and look back as to what their plan is without the end of this age coming, which is coming really fast. But what their plan is, they want to have a genetically augmented military that's cyborg trained and androgynous. They want to have a population that's completely controlled and dumbed down. And then they want to genetically engineer, if you want to call it that, a series of castes that have extended lifespans using all these new advanced technologies. And their plan is literally to create hell on earth for all of us who are not the elite. I'll leave it up to you guys toward the end of the show. Go ahead.
You want to shoot for it first, Paul, or?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting that he brings that up. If you look at the iconography of the secret societies that comprise the ruling class religion, the iconography normally deals with insects, with bees, with ants, with hives. And semiotically, this communicates a preoccupation again with oneness, with a single mind, because bees and ants and other insects, hive-oriented insects, are of one mind, and that would appear to be largely the guiding idea behind all the thrust and all the movements towards a scientific dictatorship.
I'd like to also add a prescription how to move away from that. We have to begin to build once again strong local communities, and within those strong local communities, we need to build strong families. Because it's the family and it's these smaller groupings, the microcosm where individuality is cultivated, and this is going to call for humanity to begin to exercise a degree of responsibility that we have since surrendered to others. We've given up the raising of children to the school system. We basically think that we can go off for 8 to 10 hours a day and leave Junior either stuck in front of a television monitor or in a classroom, and he's going to come out just fine and not malformed in any way. The truth of the matter is that the responsibility has to shift back to us if we don't want the children to become essentially clones, and that's a hard pill to swallow, because it calls for a large amount of effort to be exerted on our part, but there's no real alternative. The only alternative is this idea of a collective and the loss of individuality, which is one of God's greatest gifts to humanity.
Well, that's well said, and you're right. One of the objectives, obviously, of the elites was to fragment the family. They're going to use the public education system to try to get Junior into school earlier, stay longer, and the curriculum would extend even further to exactly what they want, which is a lifelong learning process, which is really lifelong indoctrination.
That's correct.
Guys, one last comment, because we're running out of time. Go ahead.
Oh, I was about to say the schoolrooms today are not there pinpointing what these kids' individual traits and strengths are, and then cultivating them. The classrooms have become more like support groups where we all sit around the tree with Socrates and talk about our feelings. And you can't expect your child to come out formed correctly under those kind of conditions. Suffering and an upward flight that basically involved a struggle, the survival of the fittest, and so you have these two ideological influences on Rhodes that basically also shape the philosophical foundations of the concept of a scientific dictatorship.
When they talk about becoming, not only in Freemasonry, but that kind of pops up, maybe called something different in a number of occult religions. What is it exactly that the initiate becomes? What's the goal? Well,
essentially the goal is basically facilitate evolution, this gradual process of transformism, which is precisely what Darwinism is. It's just one more ideational link in the chain, because the doctrines of transformism date back at least 6,000 years, all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and in Babylon. And Darwinism was simply the segue, if you will, for the doctrines of transformism that were promulgated in that era, and basically brought that occult idea of becoming into our era. It was disseminated within the context of metaphysical naturalism to give it more of a more of a secular feel. But if you look at it, essentially, it's premised upon the Kabbalistic concept of the golem, which holds that matter created itself, that which is dead can become alive, all on its own. It's also premised on
world.
That's correct. That's correct. He basically saw the Anglo-Saxons as being the master race. His ideas went back really to a teacher of his that he had, John Ruskin, who believed that the ruling class of England had possessed this tradition of morality, of beauty, that basically brought civility to the world, and was superior to all other traditions. And his fear was that the other peoples of the world would begin to assert themselves, and that this ruling class tradition would be submerged and lost. And so the only way that you could prevent that is by extending the rule of the British ruling class to the rest of the world. And these ideas of Ruskin were so powerful upon when it came to Cecil Rhodes' thinking, that Cecil Rhodes actually worked with several other ruling class figures, Alfred Milner, Stead, Lord Balfour, to name a few, and created this secret society known as the Society of the Elect, dedicated to that one goal and that one purpose. And many researchers have looked at this plan, and looked at this particular conspiratorial undercurrent, and have done a lot of good work uncovering what all was done in that regard. What many people don't understand, however, and what has been looked at, not too often looked at, is the fact that this concept that they had, that they were trying to bring into existence, this utopian concept, was basically the concept of a scientific dictatorship. It's little known that in 1877, Rhodes became a life member of Freemasonry's Apollo chapter at Oxford University. And he didn't really consider his membership in the lodge to be a serious venture, but he still admitted, nonetheless, that Freemasonry had shaped a great deal of his thinking, and that means that he was in all likelihood exposed to the idea of this occult idea of becoming that was disseminated on the popular level, where with the masses, as Darwinism. And also we see him being influenced by an individual named Winwood Reade, William Winwood Reade, and Reade's book, The Martyrdom of Man. And it was a Darwinian book. He was a Darwinian Gnostic that believed that humanity could reach this state of apotheosis, but only through terrible torrential trial and
radio on this February 27, 2005. This is Viz, and welcome to part 6 of a series entitled The Magicians of Mutability. And with us today is Philip D. Collins, who with his brother Paul co-authored the book, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, an examination of epistemic autocracy from the 19th to the 21st century. He also he actually edited, Paul's book, The Hidden Face of Terrorism. And you can find some of Philip's articles on a number of websites, biped.info, conspiracyarchive.com, and poke around for Paranoia Magazine, MK Zine, and News with Views. And I want to welcome you to the show today, Philip.
Thank you very much, Viz.
Are we doing a tag team today, or is it just you?
Tag team.
Oh, all right. So Paul's there also.
Yep.
I'm right here, Viz.
How did I clue that out so quickly? All right, and we also have Paul with us, as you know, the author of The Hidden Face of Terrorism. And thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Viz.
Topically, what are we going to hit today?
I think that it would be important for us to now head on to what's the latest installment in the erection of this scientific dictatorship. Currently, we see the whole thing being put together by a group of technocrats known as the neoconservatives, and we should really look into what they are and to really what the game plan is from their perspective and what it's bringing about. We should also take a look into Cecil Rhodes and the unique part that he played in this whole project of creating a scientific dictatorship, one like what was described by H.G. Wells in The Shape of Things to Come, and Aldous Huxley in his books Brave New World and Brave New World Revisited.
Sure, and I mean, Wells was a contemporary of Rhodes.
That's correct.
And I don't know, they have so many interlocking clubs, those old men. They have the Coefficient Club and, the Fabian Socialists, but there was a nexus of individuals in England at that time that had pretty much laid out a plan for world dominance, did they not?
That is correct. And one of the individuals that was most important to that whole project was Cecil Rhodes. I really can't think of one man throughout the last century and who really affected human history and the course which the whole of human civilization has taken more than Cecil Rhodes. So important was his role that Carroll Quigley basically based a lot of his book on the man's work. He just saw the man as having shaped the majority of what we know today to be our modern world.
Yeah, for those people who want to read more about this connection, as Philip said, Carroll Quigley has written two books. One is an absolute tome. The other is The Anglo-American Establishment, and the tome to which I referred is Tragedy and Hope. And you'll find a lot of interesting things in there with regard to the plans of these gentlemen who actually term the phrase that it is the white man's burden to rule the